The Tennessee Opportunity Act is a current piece of Tennessee legislation in both the Senate and the House, and this bill details the creation, management, and distribution of surplus TANF funding in the state of Tennessee. The biggest part of this bill is that it creates a state reserve of this surplus funding. This bill also calls for accountability of the spending of TANF funds in the state, bringing integrity to all parties involved. This bill also creates a state advisory committee as well as hires experts to be on retainer to advise this committee on community development. Another strength that this bill has is that it proposes a pilot program for implementation and planning grants for a statewide pilot program to implement evidence-based programming across the state of Tennessee. The strengths of this bill are included in the description of it, and ultimately with these federal surplus funds, we see that the state of Tennessee has an obligation and an opportunity to manage our funding and our resources in ways that are going to better serve families and Tennesseans in need. Now, with this bill, there are also weaknesses in addition to the strengths that we already see. These weaknesses that we've found include unclear language that leaves ambiguity in various places throughout the bill. Another weakness is that it could lead to unnecessary competition for funding between nonprofit organizations and local government entities. A third concern and weakness that we see with this bill is that the proposed grant guidelines would potentially put Tennessee out of compliance with federal TANF regulations, which would jeopardize other funding of TANF. And a fourth weakness that we see is that there are too few experts to be hired on as retainers. Now, with these weaknesses, we have some recommendations to improve this bill to be able to see it go through and serve the state of Tennessee as well as it can. Our first recommendation is that we see a need for an amendment for available funding to be delegated separately to nonprofit organizations and local government entities. This would eliminate that potential competition between nonprofits and local government entities. Our second recommendation is that we see that the department should define and determine these grant guidelines and criteria in alignment with federal TANF compliance regulations. This way, there would be no concern for being out of compliance with federal regulations. Our third recommendation is that 2 or more experts be hired on as retainer to provide more advising and counsel to this advisory committee. And our fourth and final recommendation is that at least one of these experts be available to community members who receive these grants so that they can help implement and advise on this evidence-based programming across the state. Ultimately, this legislation, with its strengths, with its weaknesses, with our recommendations, it would have multi-level effects and empower the communities and social workers within those communities to be able to better serve Tennessee families in need. The state government is impacted through accountability of spending, through the creation of the advisory committee, and through oversight of the pilot grant program. This legislation would also allow local government entities and nonprofit organizations and the social workers within those to be able to have access to more funding and more effective evidence-based programming. These fundings and resources would enable social workers to more efficiently serve the families that they're working with. And ultimately, this legislation would strengthen families within Tennessee by providing more funding and resources to empower these families and increase their autonomy and self-efficacy.